Hi, I'm Clara, and I remember the airport like a photograph that won't fade. The fluorescent lights hummed. The departure boards flickered. People moved in a river of luggage and announcements. I was there to see my father off, a short trip, nothing dramatic, and my stepmother, Marissa, had insisted on coming along to say goodbye properly. She wore a trench coat and a smile that never reached her eyes. My father, David, had been a quiet man since my mother died. He'd retreated into routines, early coffee, crossword puzzles, the same seat on the 7:10 shuttle. Marissa had arrived in his life like a bright, efficient storm. She organized his pills, scheduled his appointments, and learned the names of his neighbors. At first, I was grateful. Grief makes you grateful for any warmth. But warmth can be a mask. The airport was crowded. We sat near gate 12, the hum of rolling suitcases and distant boarding calls filling the space. I had my carry-on at my feet, my phone on silent. My father and I were talking about nothing, the kind of small talk that keeps big things at bay, when Marissa stood up. She had that practiced posture, shoulders back, chin up, voice ready. "Before we go," she said, loud enough for the people at the next row to hear, "I think everyone should know that Clara has been living off this family for years." Her words landed like a stone. Heads turned. My father's face went blank. I felt the air leave my lungs. She continued, voice syrupy. "We've covered her rent, her car, and even her credit card bills. It's time she paid us back." She smiled at the strangers as if she'd told a charming anecdote. People glanced at me, then at my father, then back at Marissa. A woman with a stroller shifted uncomfortably. A man in a suit pretended not to listen. I remember the physical sensations, the heat rising in my face, the prickling at the back of my neck, the way my hands went cold and then hot again. My heart thudded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to stand up and scream. I wanted to tell them the truth, that I'd been working 2 jobs, that I'd paid my own rent for years, that the only time I'd accepted money was when my father insisted after my mother's funeral. But the words lodged in my throat like a stone. My father, who had always been gentle, tried to intervene. "Marissa, that's not..." She cut him off with a look that said she'd rehearsed this. "David, I'm just being honest. People should know where their money goes." She turned to the terminal, as if the whole airport were her audience. People murmured. A child asked his mother what debt meant. My father's hands trembled on his cane. I felt small, like a child being scolded in public. The humiliation was sharp and immediate. It wasn't just the accusation. It was the performance. Marissa had chosen the busiest place she could find to make me feel small. After that, the trip home was a blur. I sat in the back seat while Marissa chattered about flights and schedules, as if nothing had happened. My father was quiet. At home, the house felt different, colder, like a room with the thermostat turned down. I replayed the scene until it became a loop of shame. I thought about every time Marissa had helped with a bill, every time she'd rearranged the photos on the mantel to include herself. I thought about my father's silence. Humiliation breeds a particular kind of clarity. It sharpens your edges. It makes you notice things you'd ignored. I began to pay attention to the small movements Marissa made, the way she logged into my father's email when he left the room, the way she took calls in the study and closed the door. I noticed receipts in the trash. I noticed the way my father's checkbook had been moved. I tried to talk to my father. He would start to say something, then stop, like a man walking through fog. Marissa was always nearby, with a hand on his arm and a look that said, "Let me handle this." She began to control the narrative. Small comments to neighbors, offhand remarks about helping me, hints that I was irresponsible. People who had known me for years began to ask awkward questions. My boss called once to ask if everything was okay. My landlord sent a polite email. The humiliation spread like a stain. The emotional arc in this section is simple. Public shame creates private resolve. I felt powerless, but powerlessness is a dangerous teacher. It forces you to learn new skills. I started to gather evidence, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I printed pay stubs, saved emails, and asked my landlord for a statement confirming my rent history. I kept copies in a folder labeled proof and emailed them to myself with timestamps. I also began to watch Marissa more closely. She would make small withdrawals from my father's account. She'd schedule consultations with a company I'd never heard of, and she'd sign documents with a flourish that looked suspiciously practiced. Each small thing was a thread. I started to pull. This section ends with the wound still fresh, but with a new, quiet determination forming. The airport humiliation was the spark. The rest of the story would be about how I turned that spark into a controlled, deliberate flame. After the airport, I stopped reacting and started documenting. Revenge that's rushed is messy. Revenge that's planned is precise. I learned to be patient. I learned to let the evidence do the talking. First, I secured my own records. I printed every pay stub, every bank transfer, every lease renewal. I made a digital folder with backups and a physical folder I kept at work. I emailed copies to a trusted friend with timestamps. I called my landlord and asked for a written statement confirming my rent history. He obliged, surprised and sympathetic. Each small confirmation was a brick in a wall I was building. Next, I started to look at my father's finances, carefully, respectfully, and with his permission when possible. I asked him casually about bills and appointments, and I watched Marissa's reactions. She would smile and say, "Oh, I took care of that," and then slip away to the study. One afternoon, while helping him sort mail, I found a stack of statements addressed to Marissa. They were for a credit card in her name, but the billing address was our house. The dates were recent. I took a photo with my phone and saved it. I also reached out to people who had seen Marissa in different contexts. A neighbor mentioned she'd seen Marissa at the bank making large withdrawals. A cousin said Marissa had been very involved in estate planning. These were whispers, but whispers can be threads. There were setbacks. Once, I confronted Marissa indirectly by asking my father about a check I'd seen in the trash. He shrugged and said, "I must have written it for something." Marissa was there, smiling, and the conversation died. Another time, I thought I'd found a smoking gun, a transfer from my father's account to an unknown company, but the bank's automated message said it was a routine transfer. I learned to expect dead ends. So, I changed tactics. I consulted a lawyer. Not to sue, not yet, but to understand what constituted financial abuse and what evidence would be persuasive. The lawyer listened, asked questions, and then said something that felt like a lifeline. If you can show a pattern of unauthorized transfers or that documents were forged, that's actionable. But you'll need records. Armed with that, I became meticulous. I requested copies of any documents Marissa had signed in my father's name. I asked the bank for a ledger of transfers, not as an accusation, but as a concerned daughter helping her father organize his finances. The bank, bound by privacy, wouldn't give me everything, but they did provide some information after my father signed a release. He was hesitant at first, but when I explained I just wanted to help, he agreed. What we found was a pattern. Small transfers at first, $200 here, $300 there, labeled as household expenses. Then larger sums, labeled as consulting fees, to a company I'd never heard of. Receipts for home repairs that never happened. A credit card with charges for jewelry and travel that my father didn't remember. The numbers added up. The pattern looked like someone slowly siphoning funds under the guise of care. I also found a document that looked like my father's signature on a power of attorney form, dated 6 months earlier. The signature was shaky, and the handwriting didn't match his usual script. I took it to a handwriting expert recommended by the lawyer. The expert called it suspicious and suggested further analysis. It wasn't proof yet, but it was a direction. While the legal and financial work moved forward, I worked on the emotional side of the plan. Marissa had humiliated me in public because she wanted an audience. I decided to give her one, but on my terms. I planned a moment that would be public, controlled, and undeniable. I invited my father to a small family gathering at a cafe near the airport, the same terminal where she'd shamed me, but this time a neutral, public place where witnesses would be natural and not staged. I told him it would be casual. I invited a few people who had seen Marissa's behavior firsthand, The neighbor who'd seen her at the bank, the cousin who'd noticed the estate planning, and the landlord who'd confirmed my rent payments.
I didn't tell them the plan.
I wanted their reactions to be genuine. Behind the scenes, I coordinated with the lawyer. We prepared a letter that would be read if necessary, outlining the suspicious transfers and requesting an explanation. We arranged for a bank representative to be on standby, ready to confirm account freezes if the evidence warranted it. I felt ridiculous and powerful at the same time, like a person who'd learned to use a tool she'd never known existed. There were moments of doubt. I worried about my father's pride, about dragging family matters into the open. I worried about being seen as petty. I worried about what would happen if the evidence wasn't enough. But every time doubt crept in, I thought of the airport, the way Marissa had smiled as she announced my debt, the way strangers had looked at me. That memory hardened into resolve. I practiced what I would say. Short sentences for tension. Long, descriptive beats for drama. I rehearsed breathing slowly, speaking clearly, and letting the evidence do the work. I learned to let silence be a tool. Silence makes people fill the space with their own guilt. The slow accumulation of proof had turned my anger into a tool. I wasn't seeking revenge for revenge's sake. I wanted to stop the slow theft of my father's life and to restore his dignity. The plan was set. The next step was execution. The day I chose felt ordinary, a bright morning with a thin winter sun. We met at the cafe near the airport, the same terminal where the humiliation had happened. The place was busy with travelers and coffee steam. I felt my palms sweat as I set the folder on the table. It was the same folder I'd kept at work, pay stubs, bank statements, the handwriting expert's notes. Each page was a small victory. Marissa arrived, of course, with that same composed smile. She sat across from us, ordered a latte, and began to talk about flights and schedules as if nothing had happened. My father looked tired but steady. The neighbor and cousin arrived, and the landlord came last, nodding as he sat down. The conversation was polite, the kind that fills space without revealing much. Halfway through the coffee, I stood up. The room quieted because standing up in a public place is an act that draws attention. I held the folder in my hands like a shield. "Before we go," I said, voice steady, "I want to read something." I opened the folder and pulled out the lawyer's letter. I read it slowly, letting each word land. I described the transfers we'd found, the suspicious consulting fees, the credit card charges for things my father didn't remember, and the power of attorney with a shaky signature. I watched Marissa's face as I spoke. At first, she smiled the way someone smiles when they think they're still in control. Then the smile faltered. When I finished, I said, "I asked the bank to review these transactions. They've placed a temporary freeze on any transfers pending investigation. I had coordinated this with the bank earlier. They were ready to confirm if needed." I reached into my pocket and dialed the number I'd been given, the bank's fraud department. The room leaned in, because the sound of a phone call in a quiet cafe is like a drumbeat. "Hello, this is Clara Hayes," I said, and then I handed the phone to my father. He listened, his face changing color as the bank representative confirmed the freeze and explained that an investigation had been opened into several transfers linked to Marissa's accounts and to a company she'd used. The representative read a short, formal statement. "Accounts frozen. Investigation underway. Please refrain from contacting the bank for further details." The silence that followed was heavy. Marissa's mouth opened and closed like a fish. She stood up, voice sharp. "This is ridiculous. You have no right to—" My father, who had been quiet for months, finally spoke. His voice was small but clear. "Marissa, is this true? Did you—" She stammered, then tried to laugh it off, but the laugh sounded brittle. Then, as if the scene needed a final, undeniable note, the handwriting expert, who had agreed to be available, walked in. He had a copy of the preliminary report and a list of the transfers. He read aloud the parts that mattered, the pattern, the dates, the inconsistencies. He said plainly, "We have reason to believe there may have been unauthorized transfers and possibly forged documents. We recommend you cooperate with the investigation." Marissa's face went from pale to red to a stunned white. She tried to speak, to accuse, to deflect, but the words fell flat. The neighbors who had once nodded politely now looked at her with something like betrayal. The landlord's jaw tightened. My father's hands trembled as he held the phone. The most satisfying moment wasn't a dramatic confession. It was the small, human unraveling. The way Marissa's practiced composure cracked, the way her eyes darted for an escape route, the way she finally sat down as if the chair could hold her. She had wanted an audience when she shamed me. Now she had one when the truth came out. The room was silent in a way that felt like justice. After the initial shock, there was a flurry of practical things. The bank took statements. The police were called to take a report. The handwriting expert confirmed that the signature on the power of attorney was inconsistent with my father's usual writing. Marissa was asked to leave the house while the investigation proceeded. My father, who had been adrift, looked at me with a mixture of shame and gratitude. He took my hand and said, "I'm so sorry I didn't see it." I didn't feel triumphant in the way I'd imagined. There was relief, a deep, physical exhale that felt like a lung filling after being underwater. There was also sorrow. I thought about the years my father had lost to manipulation, the quiet moments he'd given away. I thought about Marissa's smile and how practiced cruelty can be. I thought about the neighbors who'd been complicit through silence. In the weeks that followed, the investigation unfolded. Marissa's accounts were scrutinized. The company she'd used for consulting was revealed to be a shell. There were charges and hearings and a slow, bureaucratic unspooling of a life built on small deceptions. My father worked with the lawyer to reverse transfers where possible. He began to reclaim his autonomy in small ways, paying his own bills, making his own appointments, sitting in his favorite chair without someone else's hand on the armrest. For me, the aftermath was a lesson in the cost of truth. Justice had been served in a way that felt fair. The bank froze accounts, the law took its course, but the emotional work was ongoing. My father and I rebuilt trust slowly. We had long conversations about boundaries and pride, and the ways grief can make people vulnerable. He apologized more than once, and I forgave him more than once. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it made room for a future. I also learned something about myself. The humiliation that had once felt like a wound became a catalyst. I discovered a capacity for patience and strategy one hadn't known I had. I learned that power can be quiet and methodical, not loud and vengeful. I learned that the most satisfying revenge is the one that restores balance without destroying the people you love. Sometimes justice is loud. Sometimes it's a quiet phone call that makes a room go still. If you've ever been underestimated or shamed, remember, evidence and patience are powerful allies. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button and tell us in the comments, what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever witnessed? And, of course, subscribe for more stories like this. I'm Clara, and I'll see you next time.